Hey folks, we're doing a tier list for how effective ships are completing VHRT bounty hunting missions solo, since they're the best moneymaker in the game. I'm not going to consider things like PvP performance, or cargo, or multi-crew capability. I mean, if you want to see the multi-crew tier list, here it is. Yep, it's all Hurricanes. So I came up with this tier list based on my experience doing bounties in most of these ships in either 314 or 315. I'm rating them with the combat fit that I would use, not their default loadout, so I'll be talking about weapon and shield hardpoints, not what's fitted on ships by default. If you want to see how I approach combat with a certain ship, I've probably made a video for it, or you can let me know and I'll try to deliver. So let's take a look at the ranks. So the S tier is for ships that really outperform everything else and make VHRTs really quick and easy. A tier is for good DPS ships that I enjoy using regularly for bounties. In the B tier you'll find ships that, they're good ships and I use them occasionally for the sake of variety. In the C tier you start getting into ships that you're going to want to upgrade from. I almost never use these after I've secured a B tier ship or higher. In the D tier, you're going to find the ships that you would only really use just to say you could, or just for fun, or if you're starting out. And the F tier is for ships that don't even reach that low bar. So let's get into it. We're starting off with the Origin 100 series, which unfortunately goes in the D tier, and this applies to all variants of this hull, so that includes the 125A and the 135C. These are great little starter ships and are totally capable of doing bounty hunting missions, but with only 2 size 3 weapon hardpoints and a small shield, you just don't have a lot of DPS or survivability, which is really useful for the higher end bounties. Next up is the 300 series, which goes in the C tier. There's actually some variance in the weapons on different ships in the 300 series, but I'd say all of them except the 315P belong in the C tier. The 315P is D tier because of its low DPS. The 300i and 350R have 3 size 3 guns, and the 325A has one of those upgraded to a size 4, but in the current balance, the size 4 gun is barely better than a size 3, so the 325A only does 3% more DPS than the others with a full laser repeater loadout and the cap set to max weapons. The ships are pretty large as well, and they move well, but they're not ultra agile, so they land in the respectable C tier. Next we've got the 400i. This ship lands at the back end of C tier. It only has 2 size 4 weapons and it's slow as all heck, so it's going to take a while and it's going to be hard to keep the target in your sights, but you do have a size 3 shield, so you can take a lot of damage and should win the battle of attrition, so it barely makes it out of the D tier. Next up is the 600i, which is a strong B tier. It has excellent DPS with 3 size 5 weapons that can reach out to 2.8k range and can pop many targets in one pass, and that's your goal because this is a non-agile boat. It's got really tanky shields but a super flimsy hull, so it can be risky because damage that can penetrate through shields like missiles and ballistics will do damage directly to that hull underneath, and there's a lot of opportunity for that to happen in longer engagements because you're gigantic. You've got more than double the surface area of even the largest Connie. Next up is the Arrow, which gets a strong A tier despite having only OK DPS and a size 1 shield, because it's absolutely laser precise and it's so tiny so it's hard to hit. This ship is extremely agile both in its rotational turn rates, which are pitch, roll, yaw that you see on Urkel, and also in its translational movement, which is its ability to change its trajectory and alters momentum. So you can think of it as rotational turn rates lets you quickly change which way you're pointing, but the translational movement lets you change which way you're actually going, and this ship is excellent at both. I've also had success taking out all the VHRT targets in the ship using a fully gimbaled setup, since the size 1s on the back are gimbaled for free, and you only have to drop the size 3s to size 2s for an overall sustained DPS decrease of only 5% gimbaled. So now you're an ultra agile, tiny footprint fighter with full gimbals. It's bonkers. Next up is the Aurora MR, which is a strong C tier since it's got decent DPS and tankiness, and it can be fully gimbaled for no DPS loss since it only has size 1 hardpoints. It's got good angular agility, although it lacks a bit in its maneuvering thrust and has a low SCM speed, so it's a stepping stone to better fighters. Next up is the Avenger series, and this is a great starter ship and gets a respectable C tier listing for the same reasons as the Origin 300 series. It's got some combat chops with 2 size 3s and a size 4, but that only gives it OK DPS and it's not super agile, so C tier. The the Asperia Blade is an ultra-agile fighter with 4 fixed weapons that are locked and unswappable. Its DPS is actually pretty good for such an agile ship, but the problem is that its weapons are mixed, with what effectively amounts to 2 repeaters and 2 cannons. That makes it hard to use with mixed projectile velocities, and if you turn off one of the types of the weapons to give all your cap to the other type, your DPS becomes pretty low, so I'm calling it C tier. Next we have the Buccaneer, which is A tier and boasts the second highest DPS of the light and medium fighters, tied with the Hornet series. It's also really small and decently agile, making it a great choice if you don't mind the windscreen blur effect. The main reason I put it lower in the tier is because if some damage gets through the shields and hits those gigantic engines, the resulting torque imbalance can be pretty dreadful and can force you to either repair or reclaim the ship. Next we've got the Pisces Expedition, which is D tier since its 4 size 1s puts it on the lower end of the DPS scale, and it's not super agile and only has 1 size 1 shield. Next we have the Constellation series of ships, which all have the same pilot-controlled hardpoints and are strong A tier, primarily due to their immense DPS. They can fit 2 size 5 cannons up top, shooting up to 2.8k out, and they have 2 additional size 4 weapons on the bottom for when targets get closer. With laser cannons, you're able to easily one-pass any VHRT target in the ship with good piloting. They also have a size 3 shield, so you can tank the damage if you mess up and need a bit of time to track your target. You have crap angular turn rates though, but you have decent translational thrust for a ship this size, but to take advantage of its strengths you really need to use that fixed cannon setup. Next we've got the Cutlass series, which is a solid C tier. This jack of all trades can do everything but doesn't really excel at anything, and combat is no different. It's got decent DPS and shielding for its size, but it's not very maneuverable and its weapons can be pretty easily shot off. The Cutlass is a great option for a multi-role ship, but if I wanted a more VHRT capable multi-role ship, I personally prefer the tankier, slower Freelancer series, since it gets the same weapon hardpoints but gimbaled. Next we got the Banu Defender, which is a strong B tier since it's got 4 size 3 weapon hardpoints and a size 2 shield, but on a ship that's as maneuverable as a light fighter. It's a bit larger, so that nullifies some of the benefit of the size 2 shield, but its overall package is still really strong in my opinion. Next we've got the F7C Hornet series. This is a ship in the A tier, and it's tied with the Buccaneer in second place for the highest DPS among the lighter medium fighters, just behind the Glaive with its insane size 5 cannons. It's a lot tankier than the Buck, and it's less agile to balance that out, but I much prefer the cockpit layout as well as the flight feel of the ship, as long as you don't mind constantly pitching to your target, since your maneuvering thrusters aren't particularly fantastic. Go with the Hornet Ghost or the plain F7C Hornet to save money over the Super Hornet. Next we've got the Freelancer series, which is a solid B tier for me since it's got those 4 gimbaled size 3 weapons. In 315 there's a bug that doesn't let you swap the weapons, so you'll have either laser cannons unless you have the Freelancer Max, in which case you'll get laser repeaters. The good news is that with the gimbals you're still able to pretty easily track and kill VHRT targets, even though it's a slow ship. In my eyes, the extra size 2 shield, gimbaled weapons, and better angular turn rates bumps the Freelancer up a tier over the Cutlass, which is, the closest alternative. The Anvil Gladiator is a weak D tier because it's slow and has really low DPS. It's got okay shields for its size and a really good hull, but it's not a ship that I prefer to use for VHRTs. Next we got the Gladius, which is a strong A tier for the same reasons as the Arrow. It's a super agile light fighter with sharp handling and decent DPS. It's a chunk larger than the Arrow and has an extra shield to help compensate, and it has similar DPS as the Arrow. Like the Arrow, you can choose to take 9% sustained DPS hit to go with a full gimbal setup if you want, so that you can be more aggressive in your piloting, but I've personally found success in the Gladius with fixed weapons, and that's what I would recommend. Next we've got the Glaive, which is a B tier, despite having the same issue as the Blade with the mixed weapon types, because the Glaive has size 5 cannons, so you can turn off the repeaters and still have huge DPS. It also has 2 size 1 shields and good maneuvering thrust, which is balanced by a sluggish angular turn rate, which you actually need to help aim those slow cannons. But you've got 2.8k range, so if you're smart about your piloting you can do pretty well. Next we've got the Hawk, which is a solid A tier as a high DPS light fighter with decent agility. It's pretty quick but has low hull HP, so you'll want to keep an eye on your 2 S1 shields and be careful with your piloting. If you maneuver to avoid incoming fire and get in position to lay into your targets, you'll be able to dispatch them pretty quickly. The EMP isn't even necessary, but it can be helpful with some trickier high hull targets like our friend the Hurricane. Just remember how to roll your ship and fight in pitch, and not yaw if you can help it. Next, we've got the Hercules, which is a solid C tier, and hear me out. It's got 2 size 5 weapon hardpoints, so with laser cannons you can set yourself up for one pass opportunity since you've got that 2.8k range, and if you mess it up you actually have better pitch rates than a Connie, and 2 size 3 shields to help you tank the damage while you line up that shot to finish them off. Would I recommend this ship? Only if you want to laugh, because it's slow to maneuver, but it can definitely kill targets quickly. Next we got the Hurricane, which is a weak C tier. I know they can be a pain to kill because of their small size and their size 2 shield and their huge hull hit points, but they're only dangerous in VHRTs because of their turret gunner, and this is a solo rating. The pilot only has 2 size 4 guns, which is pretty low DPS given that the ship isn't very agile. Next we've got the Khartu-al, which is also a weak C tier. It's got the same 2 size 4 weapons that the Hurricane gets, but it's a really agile ship. But on the downside, it's got less shield HP and is a gigantic target. It's fun to fly and it looks really darn cool, but its low DPS and fragility don't do it any favors. Next, we've got the Reliant series, which is A tier, because of the combination of high DPS and good agility. The highest DPS weapon loadout is a mostly gimbaled setup by default, so you can actually go fully gimbaled at almost no DPS loss. This ship has really great maneuvering thrust, so even though its rotational agility isn't high, if you're good about rolling and strafing, the ship feels really agile. And you're fighting large, slow VHRT targets, so beyond a certain agility threshold, it doesn't really matter. And you get excellent cockpit visibility, and you can see a lot of MFDs by default, which I love. Its main weakness is its size, but because of its unique vertical shape, you've got a really small cross-section if you're fighting in pitch. I should note that there are some bugs with retrieving the ships on pads in 3.15, but if you just log out of the ship in space when you're done bounty hunting and claim it the next time you log in, that'll work around them. All Reliants can fit the same weapon setup, so I'd recommend getting a core which is cheapest or upgrading to a Tana for the extra missiles if that's your jam. Next, we've got the M50, which is D tier. It's really small, agile, and fast, and even has 2 size 1 shields, but it's got really low DPS, and with only 2 size 2 guns, it's fun, but it's not really efficient. Next we've got the MSR, which is D tier. It's big, slow, and has low DPS. These are not the fighters you're looking for. Next we've got the Mustang Alpha, which is actually B tier. It's got decent DPS and is comparable in many ways to the Gladius, although it is a bit more flimsy. On paper, it's actually got sustained DPS that's higher than the Gladius and better translational agility, but I find the Gladius easier to pilot in combat thanks to its better SCM speed. One other thing to note is that if you go laser cannons with the Alpha, you'll actually start overheating and that'll limit your real DPS, so you're kinda tied to using repeaters unless you want to deal with heat management. On the plus side, you can get a fully gimbaled setup at no cost, so that's nice. Next up we've got the Mustang Delta, which is a solid A tier. The flying characteristics are pretty much the same as the Alpha, but the Delta upsizes the wing weapon hardpoints compared to the Alpha for a slight increase in DPS, and it gets you 2 fixed rocket pods with 36 seconds of firing time in them. Even though the rockets have a cannon-esque projectile speed, you can find opportunities to fire them, and I found that to be pretty helpful, so I've bumped the Delta up a tier. That said, I still personally find the Arrow or the Gladius easier to fight in, since the Delta still has that flimsier body and lower SCM speed. Next we've got the Nomad, which is a low C tier. It's got the same weapon hardpoints as a Gladius, but a weaker capacitor pool, so you actually do 5% less DPS. It's got 3 size 1 shields to help compensate for its larger size, but in a VHRT it's just not quite enough given that you're not agile enough to effectively evade incoming fire. That said, it's still a C tier because it's got a good hull and okay DPS. Next we've got the Prospector. So it's definitely S-class. No, the Prospector is F-class. I've done VHRTs in it. I failed. Don't be like me. Next, we've got the Prowler. The Prowler is a C tier because of its 2 size 5 weapons. You can put laser cannons on them and try to one-pass targets like in the Connie and the Hercules, and you're a bit more agile to actually try and track them as they fly by. But you're also large with some wonky, unwieldy wings which are practically begging to get shot off. And 2 size 2 shields may seem pretty good, but if you're in a VHRT with 2 Hurricanes, they definitely don't last long. And to be clear, this is by no means an agile ship, it's just agile compared to something like a Hercules. So yeah, size 5 cannons carries it into C-Class. Are you noticing a theme? Next we've got the Razor series. The Razor series is D tier, and it's basically the same as the M50 in that it's a small, fast, and agile, but it's got really weak DPS. It's fun, but it's not efficient. Now we've got the Redeemer. Okay, so the Redeemer is a middling B tier. Remember, we're talking about a solo pilot, so we don't get to use those OP size 5 turrets. But the funny thing about the Redeemer is that it's the only ship that gives the pilot control of a weapon with a turret-bound capacitor. So if you fit ballistics on the main size 4 pilot guns, the remaining 2 size 3 guns that the pilot can also control don't need any weapon capacitor to function, and they get the crazy high recharge rate of turrets, so they can basically fire forever. So now you've got a ship with 2 size 4 weapons and 2 size 3 weapons that's basically invincible with 2 size 3 shields, and capacitor to put wherever you want. Its primary downside, and it is a big one, is that its angular turn rate is total garbage. You can help counter that by boosting while turning with your cap set to engines, but you're inevitably going to get yourself into situations where you're in a slow ship trying to turn to catch ships that are flying around you because you don't have the DPS to kill enemies before they get behind you. It's still a fun ship though with that crazy pilot-controlled turret, so B class. Next we've got the Sabre, which is B tier. It's got decent sustained DPS, but it's not terribly agile and has a pretty large cross-section. On low pop servers, that can make dealing with incoming damage a bit tricky, but it's still a fun ship to fly. Like the Hornet, you got a big advantage to your pitch rates compared to your yaw rates, so try to roll and fight in pitch. Next we've got the Vanguard, which is an absolutely solid S tier, assuming you fit it with size 5 cannon on the nose and equip the Vanguard specific MVSA cannons that you can now buy at Cousin Crow's in Orison. This setup gives the Vanguard really high DPS, and combined with its 2 size 2 shields and having decent agility for a heavy fighter, this ship is an absolute beast at VHRTs and can even one-pass a lot of targets. Without S5 cannons and MVSAs, the ship drops to C tier because it literally doubles your sustained DPS to use the referred fit. I prefer the Sentinel as it's the most agile Vanguard and it comes with an EMP, but you could also go Harbinger if you want to have some higher damage reduction and those size 5 missiles. Next we've got the Talon, which is C tier due to having mediocre DPS with only 2 size 4 weapons. Yes, you've got some of the highest agility in the game, so you'll always be able to stay on target, but once you've cleared that threshold of agility, you still need to wait to kill your enemy. And with the Talon, you've got these large flimsy wings that can easily get shot off or, let's be honest, get rammed off, and then you've lost control of the ship and have to eject. Next is the Talon Shrike, which is a low D tier because it's basically the same as the Talon, but it takes 2 size 4 weapons with the Talon and downgrades them to 2 size 2 weapons in exchange for 24 size 3 missiles, which is a terrible trade when it comes to reliably killing VHRT size targets, since missiles often miss for unknown reasons, and they sometimes even hit your own ship. So next is the Terrapin, which is a very low D tier. Both it and the Valkyrie are D tier actually, and for the same reasons. They are large, slow ships that have really low DPS with only 2 size 2 weapons for the pilot. Full disclosure, I haven't actually flown these 2 ships in VHRTs, but I've flown enough ships with 2 size 2 weapons to know that I don't want to. Next, we've got the Ares Inferno, which is solidly S tier at VHRTs. It's tied to using ballistic weapons, so you do have limited ammo, but 3 minutes of firing time at a ludicrous 4700 plus DPS is enough to easily chain lots of bounties. I did around 10 VHRTs killing all the ships and an ERT before reloading, but I did try to use some pretty good trigger discipline. And lastly, we get our Ares Ion, which can only fit in the Ares Ion tier. It's just that good. It's changed the game for VHRT efficiency. If you nail your shots just right, you can 2-shot Wardens, 3-shot Hurricanes, and 4-shot Valkyries. It'll often take an extra shot or two since you won't always land them perfectly, but it's still completely bonkers. And with such high DPS, you'll remove enemies off the field so quickly that your 2 size 2 shields are more than sufficient. And for the most part, you don't even need to keep your capacitor to weapons, because your magazine has more than enough ammo to kill every target in a VHRT if you're not just holding the trigger down. So you can keep it on thrusters to help make this decently agile heavy fighter even more agile. If you look up the word power creep in the dictionary, there's a picture of this ship. So there's my tier list, folks. Most of these ships stay in the same tier whether you go cannons or repeaters. More agile ships will generally handle cannons better because they'll be able to control range and lead their shots better. If the ship can fit size 5 guns though, it should usually fit size 5 cannons because they do a lot more DPS than anything else. Otherwise, I usually go repeaters. If you've got any questions or comments, please let me know. Thanks for watching, folks. I hope you've liked this video. Cheers!